Hello, and welcome to Books in the World. I'm your host, Kathleen Murphy. Books in the World is an interview show produced by the Cape Cod Writers Center and the Cape Media Center. The Writers Center was established over 60 years ago and sponsors a 4-day writers conference every summer on Cape Cod. In August 2023, we returned to a live and in-person conference. Books in the World has been broadcast continuously for 45 years, making it the longest-running program of its kind in the United States. The goal of this program is to show how writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field play their roles in the world of books and other communication media. I am delighted today to welcome author David Daniel and talk about his short story collection, Beachtown Stories. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Kathleen. Glad to be here.
David's stories have appeared in magazines and anthologies alongside works by such luminaries as Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson. He is author of more than a dozen books, including an award-winning mystery series featuring a private investigator called Alex Rasmussen. Born in Boston, this author has been a carpenter, a clam digger, a tennis pro, and a brain slicer in the neuropathology lab at Harvard Medical School. He currently teaches for the University of Massachusetts at Lowell and serves on the board of trustees at the Middlesex Academy Charter School. His most recent book that we'll talk about today, Beachtown, is a collection of short stories that I really enjoyed. Some of the tales are moody or mysterious. Some have happy endings. Others not so much. Some made me laugh out loud. In combination, they provide a deep insight on some very colorful coastal New England characters during the 1950s and the 1960s. Because they felt so familiar, at first, I thought of these as distinctly American stories. But after I finished the book, some of his characters really stayed with me. And I recognized that the author had touched on universal human themes: love, jealousy, fear, longing, and youthful joy. I'm so lucky to have this opportunity to be able to speak with the author himself about all of this. So welcome again, David Daniel.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here, Kathleen.
So tell me how you would describe Beachtown.
Sure. It's a collection of stories, as you said, that are kind of linked by the common denominator of place. And they share a number of themes. You mentioned some of them, but certainly the idea of youth, of coming of age, of romance, of cars, of high school. And then they kind of transition through time into, themes of midlife, growing old, and death in some ways. And the book's divided into two sections, one appropriately called, for a book titled Beachtown, called Summer, and then the second section is Other Seasons. And it deals in many ways, as you've suggested, with a kind of loss of innocence, particularly that period that you alluded to, the 50s and the 60s, as a kind of innocent age.
Yeah. So what motivated you to write this?
It's interesting because a collection of stories is usually not something one sits down to write. You sit down to write each story at some point in time. And these were written really over a period of, I dare say, 40 years, which is to say that some of the earliest ones go back to publication back in the 70s and 80s. So unlike a novel, say, which you sit down to write a book, with stories, it's almost an after fact of culling together a collection of things that have happened and been written over periods of time, not with any intention ever to bring them all together. But that's what you do. You kind of go through your stock. And in this case, I had to probably comb through about 50 stories and sort of skim out the ones that I thought might make the best grouping. And so that's how Beach Town came about.
So you're kind of contrasting that as writing a series of short stories versus writing a novel. Did you have a preference? Do you prefer to write novels, or do you like the short stories? I mean, where do you fall on that?
I really like both, but there's a significant difference in terms of labor involved, because with a novel, one sits down on a given day with the knowledge that a year from that day, you'll probably still be embarked on working on that book. With a short story, and I got into a period where I was writing a lot of very short fiction, I would sometimes write 2 and maybe 3, and maybe on a really good day, 4 stories in a day, which is not to say those are the final versions. Of course, they undergo the revisions and so on. But so there's a much shorter span of time, and therefore you get a lot more satisfaction from the process. Whereas, for many years I was a long distance runner, and I think running taught me a lot about writing in the same way writing taught me about writing. And it's simply that I don't think I ever went out for a long run and really enjoyed the act of running. It was always the good feeling that you got after you'd finished for the day. And writing is like that for me, short or long. I rarely have fun while I'm doing it, probably because if you're doing it well, you're in some kind of zone and you're not even thinking about that. But there's always that wonderful feeling of having written, and it can kind of put a glow on your whole day if you feel like you turned out some good pages. So with short stories, I think there was more immediate gratification. A novel is like a very, very complicated thing that you've got to assemble, and sometimes you're doing it without instruction. So I like both processes, but I think the stories in some ways is easier.
Yeah, I can see how you would say that. I'm going to depart a little bit from our original questions and say, tell me about the books the mysteries that you wrote. So it's a four book series, or?
Yes,
yeah. How did you get started on that?
Those came about simply by making a geographic move. My wife and I were living closer to Boston. We were in Arlington, and for one reason or another, jobs, etc., we moved out to Lowell in the mid-1980s. And walking around the streets of Lowell, I mean, I had never had any notion of writing a mystery. I'd written other things. But walking around that, sort of in those days, beat up old mill town that is Lowell, Massachusetts, like so many cities and towns throughout New England, it really whispered to me, if you might say, a muse telling me that this is a city you can write about, and you can write about it because you bring fresh eyes to it. I didn't know Lowell. I'd never really seen it. I'd never experienced it. Over time, just walking the streets, cobblestone streets, old gas lantern fixtures along the streets, old red brick mill buildings, and it had a real lot of flavor and charm that just seemed to say hard-boiled private eye. And so I wrote the first of those, enjoyed the experience. So that one went fast. I wrote it in about 6 weeks. Liked it so well, I did a second one. Couldn't find any interest in them. Sent them out to publishers. Got some, pats on the head, nice job, but and then I entered it into a contest, St. Martin's Press, which actually had previously rejected the book, and it won the contest, and so launched that series. So that's how they came about.
The first book, was it Heart of, what was it?
The Heavenstone.
The Heavenstone.
The Heavenstone, the Skelly Man,
Yeah.
Goofy Foot, which uses a kind of a South Shore setting. Mm-hmm. And then the last one was The Marble Kite. So there are a series that are kind of linked, but it's a series where you can jump in at any point. Key points of biography are mentioned in each one, so you don't have to start with the first.
Good. Well, I feel like, having read your short stories, I feel like I'm in capable hands and would be happy to try a mystery as well of yours. It would be fun, I think. So is this book biographical? The short stories, you said you grew up in Weymouth, you grew up in a coastal town. So tell me back to Beach Town, the short story book.
Yeah.
What is it? How biographical is it? I mean, if your hometown friends read this, would they recognize themselves? Would they recognize you?
I mean, that's a great question, and I guess I asked myself that. I mean, I think any writer sits down and with a story, you're kind of making a stab at the truth, some kind of truth, even though it's fiction. And so you tend to write out of what you know. And I've always said that if people are looking for story ideas, and story ideas are everywhere, as you know, a great place to sink your shovel is in a place you know well, but maybe have gone away from and left. The other good way to do it is dig your shovel into a place you don't know well, which I did with Lowell, because you can bring fresh eyes to it. But in terms of the autobiography, it's loosely based on that. And I changed the name from Weymouth to Weybridge and some of the surrounding towns as well, just to give myself a little liberty and independence to change pertinent details so it doesn't necessarily have to be held up to the litmus test of, wait a minute, that's not Weymouth. That street doesn't go that way. The beach isn't there. And so you can make it your own. There are characters in there who are inspired by events and people. But for the most part, it is whole cloth fiction drawn from my sense of having been there and grown up there.
I love how you have threads through all of these short stories for Weybridge, the featured town, the shipyard, for instance.
Yeah.
So that was a big part of Weybridge's history. And almost all of the characters had some association with the shipyard. And a lot of them had associations with other themes that you wove through them. Do you want to share some of those themes?
Sure. I mean, you hit on a big one, the shipyard, because in North Weymouth, at the end of town I grew up in, the Four River Shipyard was there, and it contributed not only jobs to a lot of the families in the town, but there were always these loud sounds coming from there, whether it was the whistles or huge clanging, banging as they're assembling these giant ships over there. And the other thing that was there in North Weymouth was the Procter & Gamble soap factory. And so we got the sounds of the shipyard and the sweet, sometimes oversweet aromas of soaps being made over at Procter & Gamble. So those are things, clam digging. And clam digging, where I was living, or I lived in Weymouth, and did a number of summers, is kind of a different way than people dig clams on the Cape, where I think often you're going after quahogs and harder shelled clams. Not that there aren't steamers there as well in the coastal coves, but we did it. It was largely clams that would be used for steamers, and so clam digging became a common denominator. And the high school became a common denominator. The beach, a very big common denominator, because even though the beach is in the north end of town, it's where we all gathered, no matter what part of town people were from. Summers were spent kind of lollygagging at the beach. And those were a carefree time when people held summer jobs, but there was, my sense was there was a lot more leisure that we tended to enjoy sort of before the paroxysms that followed with political assassinations and a prolonged war in Southeast Asia, etc.
Yeah, yeah. And twins. You mentioned twins in a couple of them too.
Yeah, and until you mentioned that, I'm not consciously aware of having done that. But if I were to dig into the psychologies of it, I think I might come up with something. I have twins in my family. A niece of mine has twins. But yeah, I didn't even think of that until you mentioned it.
Well, some of these themes, the shipyard, what you said about the sounds and the smells, and I feel like some of these themes make it like I said in the beginning, in the intro, it's not just an American story. It is. It's got a lot of American norms in it. But you definitely hit on universal themes. You know, when you're talking about the shipyard, you use that as an entree to get into the difference between the people that work at the shipyard, or maybe are supervisors or managers, or people that don't work at the shipyard and instead are commuters and they go into Boston. So I just really liked how you took American stories and you kind of made universal themes out of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does make sense. And I think, as you know, themes often are wholly unintentional on the author's part, that if you're telling a story that grips you, engages you, you write it the best way you can with bringing the deepest understanding you can to your materials. And I think themes kind of sort of organically emerge, rise up out of the stories, and then you look at them. There's a number of stories in there, but one that kind of comes to mind is a story called Islands, about, and it really deals with some people's inability to let go of what they knew in high school. Because for many people, and certainly not everybody, high school is a kind of magical time. We don't always think of it at the time, but we look back with a certain nostalgia and affection because life seems so much simpler and easier. And we're going through a lot of rites of passage and first experiences. And in that story, it's a young woman that's really dealing with some mental health issues, I think, and an inability to kind of find her way in a world that now has gone, and other people seem to be getting on with their lives. And so in the same way that happens there are other stories of people that are new to town, like in a story called The Late Bus, or a story called Dinner Music for Cannibals, a young girl who has gone away and experienced life elsewhere and now comes home to a rather rancorous Thanksgiving Day gathering with her family. And so, you know, you write the stories the best way you can and let the themes sort of take care of themselves. And sometimes, I guess, if you recognize that there's theme going on as you reread it, well, maybe you can punch it up here and there to make sure that it comes through. But I've always been a big believer that, you know, concentrate on your characters, make them complex if you can, keep your plots interesting and simple if possible, and let themes kind of take care of themselves. And so that's my sense on that.
Yeah. And you teach these concepts when you're working at University of Lowell and when you were teaching at Middlesex chapter, what was it? Chapter school?
Charter school.
Charter school, excuse me, yeah. So, you know, it's funny because we've got the 60th anniversary of the Cape Cod Writers Center annual conference coming up this August from the 3rd to the 6th. So what do you like when you have to teach a class, a semester of writing? How do you go about it? What do you approach? And it sounds like character development is top on your list.
Certainly one of the things, you know, and I try to give it a kind of a full body approach, and so that we're looking at stories, reading stories, talking about stories, some classic stories, student work as well, and, you know, in the process of deconstruction, trying to not destroy people's appreciation of the stories, actually in some ways enhance it if possible, but to look at the body parts of a story. And I sometimes will use that metaphor going back to my days working as a young guy at the Harvard Medical School. You're dissecting stories as if you had a cadaver on a table over time and looking at the various body parts, which would be, you know, plot, characters, setting, manipulation of time, dialogue, all of the things that go into making a story. So I try to make it a fun experience and lead my students along bit by bit till they start to really see that it's an assembling of many parts, because it's a difficult craft to learn and it takes time, but it can be learned.
When you talk about the flow of a story, you're right. There's a lot of stories today that have they hop around. You know, you're in one time frame and then all of a sudden you're going to a different time frame. So you, as a reader, you're looking at it and you're saying, wait a minute, so what time frame are we in now? And it's supposed to be that the subtext gives you some of that, but it's a very complicated thing to do, to look big picture. And there's a big difference between writing the details of someone and then plotting the whole thing. Like how do you best tell the story? So it's challenging. You must have faced some challenging situations with some of your students to get them to that point where they felt like they'd told the story, maybe not from A to Z, but to best highlight the elements of the story that they wanted.
Very true. I'd like to remind them that you can't fail in one sense because there's no absolutely right way to do it. But when you speak about how you're manipulating time, I used to, when people say, well, what do you do? I sometimes would say, oh, I build time machines in my basement in my spare time. And in effect, a story is a kind of a time machine, and there's no one way to do it. So if you're telling a memoir, you're dealing with a span of a period of life. How do you want to? Do you want to sort of start with some good stuff, get your readers interested, and then through flashback and other ways of manipulating time, bring back things that might not be so interesting that you want to front end load your story with them? So there are lots of decisions that go in, but I always remind people that there's not a right way. And in effect, you're not going to fail. And then if you do, nothing's going to change. You have the ability and opportunity to go back and maybe try to get it a little bit more skillful. So I think it's about skillfulness rather than the right way or the wrong way to do it.
Well, it sounds like you're a good teacher.
Well, thank you.
So are you working on another writing project? Now that you've finished this short story series, are you going to go back to novels, or what are you thinking of?
I've kind of got a half-baked notion at some point, maybe not immediately. As I said before, there were a number of stories that I kind of left out of the Beachtown collection that nevertheless deal with that little piece of real estate there on the South Shore. I first visited it actually some years before that in a novel called Reunion, which is about a fellow going back to his 30th high school reunion in Weybridge. And kind of that sort of set a template of long form writing about it. I don't think I'd do another novel about it, but I certainly could go back and cull together another assortment of stories, depending on how this one strikes readers.
Right.
Beyond that, I am working on a kind of pastiche set in the 1930s, and I won't say anything more about it than that because I'm still working it out. But that would be a kind of an interesting to write a novel in a period long before I was born and see if I can get the details right.
That sounds exciting. That sounds interesting. So Beachtown is the story. Oh, one more question about it. The cover that you had done for Beachtown, that's a painting or is it a photograph or both?
Good question. It's actually a painting by a very talented artist who lives up and operates up out of the Hampton Beach area. And she has a series of paintings. She's got a website. And with the publisher at Loom Press, I talked over what I wanted for a cover. And I took a look at some of her paintings, and I really liked that one. It was very evocative. It's called Vacancy. And so we got permission to use it for the cover. But yeah, I think the look of the book, I like it a lot. There were some other suggested openings and cover art shown to me, and this is the one that really struck me as being most connected to the vision I had in my mind for the stories.
It's very good. It's very, very good. I definitely enjoyed it. Yeah. So thank you so much for being on the show today and talking about all of the writing, and congratulations on the book. I think it's really good.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Sure. Oh, good. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. If you'd like to see more, check us out on our website, capecodwriterscenter.org, through our Facebook page, and on YouTube. Thank you again for watching Books in the World.